Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show. Hi Laura, how are you?
Yeah, good Julia. How are you getting on? The sun is still shining in the northeast. Have you had a busy week?
I know, it's actually really nice and bright and warm again today. Yes, I've had a really busy week. I'm on deadline this week. I'm writing a massive report on the circular economy, which is really, really interesting, but the deadline is now looming. So I've been holed up and just making sure I get the words down. How about you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Basically, my week's been to stop trying to raid the fridge every 2 minutes. It's always too tempting when you're working from home. So doing this with you today has been a good distraction.
Excellent. And we're really excited to say we have our first international guest this week as well, Richard Tufton.
It's so exciting. So Richard used to work for Dawn Meats, and that's when I first met him. And now he's been living in the US in Austin, Texas for almost 5 years. So he's given us some great perspective, not only on the meat category and his insight about what's happening over there broadly with meat and livestock, but also grocery more generally. So it's given us some brilliant insights on what's happening in the US and maybe things that will come over here.
And we're very excited to say that we also have a sponsor for this week's episode. It's Shopper Intelligence, the first and only syndicated measurement program built from the direct voice of food and drink shoppers, with unique store-wide metrics in dozens of categories, giving you why and how shoppers buy, not just what they buy.
And if you'd like more information, go to shopperintelligence.com and the link is in the show notes.
Great. Let's start the show. Richard, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. How does a Brit end up in Texas involved in the meat business?
Yeah, so I moved over to Texas about 4.5 years ago. I was working for a British meat company, an Irish meat company called Dawn Meats. And one of the customers that I looked after was Whole Foods, who their head store was down in London, which is where I was living at the time. And through that relationship, I got to meet some of the American folk from Whole Foods who came over from Austin, Texas, which is where their corporate office is located. Whilst all that was going on, I'd started dating my now wife, who is a Texan from Austin. And so we had a few trips over for weddings and things and really liked it over here in Austin. And so I kind of put the two things together, and through my Whole Foods connections, got a job to work for one of their suppliers. My mission was to try and go over and help support suppliers who are in the kind of better for you space, looking to try to promote better animal welfare, food quality, meat quality, all of those kind of things that were really important to me. And it was quite eye-opening for me to discover how industrial a lot of the American meat world is. And so that happened, about 4.5 years ago. My wife was 3 months pregnant at the time when we moved over, and we now are here with a 2-year-old and a 2-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl, and loving Austin, Texas life in quarantine.
And we're really proud to say you're our first international guest as well on the show. We're really excited to get your perspective on so many of the topics we'll be covering today, not least because, meat standards in a US, UK context are, of course, quite a hot topic at the moment as well. So I think there'll be some really meaty topics for us to dive into. Why don't you tell us about the first pick that you have for us?
Yeah, so my first pick is from the New York Times. It's an article based on a couple of offbeat comments that Trump made last week to the press. And it's the article's called "Trump Floats Halt to U.S. Cattle Imports as Pandemic Hurts Ranchers." And the big problem that we've got in the States right now, and I'm sure in the UK too, is that the slaughterhouses and processing plants are way off full capacity. They're probably at about 60% capacity. And so what that means is you've got a lot of ranchers throughout the country who have animals that need to go to the next stage in the process, but that can't happen. And so there's a lot of very negative energy. And I guess these are all quite key voters in key states for Trump. And bear in mind, the election is coming up in November. So he's trying to do everything possible to show his voters that he's doing all he can to help them out. And, there are some pretty huge arable livestock parts of the country. So the situation that he was commenting on last week is that a lot of cattle get imported from both Mexico and Canada live to be slaughtered in slaughterhouses that are quite near the border, but the American side of the border. And it is an interesting topic because there is such a backlog of cattle over here right now. So why would you want to import animals from Mexico, for example? And the reason that exists in the first place is because most of the Mexican cattle are different to the American cattle. So they're mostly kind of Brahman cattle, so they're much cheaper. The quality is different, and a lot of them will end up in hamburger meat, essentially. And the Americans are huge consumers of hamburgers, and so that ground beef market is probably 45-50% of all meat consumed is hamburger meat. And so America needs sources of cheap cattle to basically put into burgers, and whether that's coming in as live across the border from Mexico, or whether it's coming in as processed meat from, most recently there was headlines about meat coming in from Namibia. That's all for that purpose, to kind of prop up that part of the industry, which is such a big way that Americans consume. So what Trump was basically saying was, we're going to consider putting an end to the live cattle flow coming in from Mexico and Canada. I don't think Canada's as much of a factor. It's the Mexican side that's more interesting. And obviously, when he said that was very popular with ranchers who are sitting there with lots of cattle that they need to get through to the next part of the system. But yeah, it's such an extreme time over here.
It's a fascinating article, and it's great to get your perspective of it on the ground. One thing I was wondering reading it is, if you're a supermarket buyer and the demand for product is going up, and I know food service it has dropped off but will continue to come back, will that actually drive more imported boxed product? Fair enough if Trump's, saying no Canadian, no Mexican live, but if you need to stack a shelf, does it drive actually more demand for Namibian or whatever it may be if you're trying to keep your fixture full?
Yeah, well, my take on it is that imports are helping us right now, as in boxed, slaughtered, packaged meats coming in, because that kind of bypasses the slaughterhouse, which is a bottleneck. But what it doesn't bypass are the processing plants, which are also a bottleneck. So it definitely helps because it kind of goes past one of the hurdles, but it doesn't jump the second one. So this meat still has to be processed. You can't put a 60-pound lump of meat on a supermarket shelf. You've got to turn that into 1 pound ground bricks of beef and things like that. So but it's definitely helping. And I think there's a lot of not misinformation, but just not really understanding the situation properly. And there was a viral video last week of a farmer getting really upset when he learned that meat was coming into the country. But actually that's helping, because it's helping keep the demand, keep the prices reasonable, so buyers will keep buying. But I can see why it's upsetting for these ranchers, and they're sitting there with all these cattle and nowhere for them to go, or pigs or chickens,
And do you think, I could talk about this all day, and I won't, Julia, I promise, but tell me about country of origin labelling. Do you think that'll drive a change in the States? Because I know the US haven't always been keen to go down that route, but will this force that issue?
Well, I think it might do, but I think honestly, for now, they're wanting to keep their net as wide as possible. And I think it's going to be a while until we see that come into play.
Yeah.
But they're definitely under a lot of pressure to do that. And, labeling country of origin as being made in the US, when actually the meat can come from elsewhere, be processed, and that's the label. It's really confusing, and it's extremely political. And I can't see anything happening until after the election.
Has there been much from Biden at all on the situation in the feed sector? Are we getting a sense of what kind of messages he might be coming out with to go up against Trump in the election?
Biden hasn't really said too much about it, or if he has, I haven't been following it. But I think, the truth is that both Trump and Biden will want the votes of rural America, and that means they need to look after the corn farmers and the cattle ranchers. And so whatever they're going to say to get the votes of that huge population is what they will say. But honestly, I haven't heard too much about what Biden's been weighing in with this.
It's a really fascinating article. Thank you so much for sharing that. Laura, what's your first pick this week?
So my first pick is an article from The Conversation, and the two authors are two Kiwi university academics, and the title is "Coronavirus has turned retail therapy into retail anxiety. Keeping customers calm will be the key to carrying on." And as I've previously mentioned, shopping is my hobby because that's how sad my life is. So I was really interested to have a read of this. And we have previously spoken about, some of the differences that we're seeing in retail, particularly in the grocery sector. But this article is a little bit more broad-reaching and looking at things about store atmospherics and how important our sensory atmospherics will be going forwards. So the first thing it says in the article is about noise, which is something that I've never even considered. But in New Zealand, the tips on how to stay safe post-COVID is about reducing the noise in shops and in restaurants and keeping the music volume low. And it quotes that raised voices, it seems, can generate a wider moist breath zone that may increase the viral spread, which I hadn't even considered, the possibility of you're there and you're shouting and actually that could raise the chance of getting coronavirus. It looks about other things, and it's interesting because we're seeing this already in the UK, and it was watching some things about M&S yesterday, very similar. Retail guidelines in New Zealand recommend customers only touch and try merchandise they intend to buy. Well, the environment that we've lived in for decades is all about, hopefully, that store theatre and being involved, and particularly in the clothing sector, you want to be able to try on those items. And it really makes me think about the amount of online returns we're probably doing at the moment, but probably myself included, about what's happening to those items. They surely must be getting repackaged and sent back out. And then the other area that really jumped out for me from this article was about shopping as a sensory experience that'll change. And it talks about cosmetics. And when we think about, the big department stores, and John Lewis talking about, how they're going to start reopening over the next couple of weeks, that huge amount of square footage that's given to cosmetics and perfume and that category, that no longer are we going to be able to try and sample these sort of things, really high margin products, and without being able to, how are people going to have the confidence and be able to buy them, and how it will actually change us going forward. So I found it hugely interesting and giving insights that I'd never even considered before. What were your thoughts? What did you think, Richard?
It made me wonder, with everybody wearing masks, presumably people's eye makeup game is going to have to really go up because we're all going to. It was interesting. Moist breath zone is a gross expression, isn't it? I was like, oh God, that's now going to make me think whenever I go about what people's moist breath zone is. And then also the bit where it talks about the restaurant in New Jersey where they put mannequins out. That is going to be a bizarre experience if you ever have to go to a restaurant where there are going to be mannequins hanging out around you. But yeah, I thought it was fascinating. I mean, I've, as I mentioned, got 2 small kids, so no longer do we kind of browse the shops. If we're going shopping, it's dedicated. We know what we're in there for. We'll go to, if possible, we'll find an app which says exactly where the item is in the store. We'll go there, get it, and leave. And I think there's going to be a lot more shopping like that, where people do their research beforehand and go in to get the one thing and come out. And I think, yeah, the days of try before you buy. Obviously, I'm not somebody who spends too much time in the makeup department, but I should imagine they're really going to struggle and have to change that up, because it's going to be really focused buying going forwards. But yeah, what do you think, Julia?
I loved the article. I mean, like you, moist breath zone is a phrase that's going to haunt me, I think. But yeah, I some really fascinating detail, I think, there around shopper behaviour. And the thing that really jumped out at me also was just the implications that has for some of the, revival of the high street projects that we've been seeing recently. So much of those are precisely about sort of injecting theatre into stores, really making the most of having a physical location, trying to make sure that you sort of get away from that more transactional style of shopping and really offering an experience that you can't get online. What do you do now, when that sort of experiential shopping isn't possible? And the second point that I thought was really interesting, aside from the fact that I learned that Hilton Hotels has a partnership with a disinfectant brand now, that was quite interesting, is also this sort of idea of reinventing the restaurant experience. And there is that incredibly creepy picture of the mannequins that are sort of trying to stop you from getting too close to other guests. But it also reminded me of an initiative in Amsterdam, I think, where a restaurant there has sort of designed mini glass houses almost, where you can sort of sit in couples in your own little mini glass house and have a waiter come and sort of, serve you your food in a very safe and socially distanced way. I wonder whether we're going to start seeing more concepts like that.
What was your first article, Julia?
So my first pick this week is from The Economist. And it's an article called Farewell for Now to a Golden Age of Drinking. And it's about how the coronavirus outbreak has hurt global booze sales. And I picked this article because my initial reaction when I saw the headline was, hang on a minute, I thought booze sales were booming. We've been seeing lots of headlines, lots of coverage of record alcohol sales during the lockdown. Latest Kantar figures that are out this week showing sales of alcohol were 50% higher than last year in the most recent 4-week period. Lots of alcohol companies, alcohol brands have done some really interesting new online delivery and direct-to-consumer models. So it just jarred a little bit with what I thought was happening out there. But what the article explains is that, yes, that is true. Sales of alcohol for in-home consumption are indeed doing very nicely. But there are, of course, parts of the market that are really, really suffering. And what's more, the article sort of looks ahead to what's coming down the line as well, and why the sector might find itself into some trouble. And it really points to 3 reasons for that. There's the lockdown itself and what it's done to some really crucial sales channels. So we're talking about the hospitality sector, of course, wine and spirit producers in particular, so reliant on sales through bars and restaurants. That's not happening right now. And even if you can get the volumes back through in-home consumption, you're not getting those nice markups that you might be able to push through in some of those hospitality channels. Mass entertainment and sporting events, big impact on beer, wine, champagne as well. And travel. But of course, travel is a massive channel for the alcohol sector. You don't have people going to airports at the moment. They're not killing time in the departure lounge and stocking up on some nice pricey booze. So again, that's obviously making a big dent in brands' sales. The other big reason for why the alcohol sector is in for a tough time is about economic hardship. We are going to emerge from this crisis into a pretty dire economic climate. People are going to have less disposable income. And so some of the big money spinners of recent years, more premium drinks, more artisanal drinks, the whole craft movement is really going to feel some pressure. And then the third reason that the article points to is about a wider demographic shift that was already happening before this crisis struck. And that's really about younger consumers, Gen Z consumers, being less interested in alcohol than older generations. We've had the rise of no and low alcohol alternatives, but also the legal cannabis economy in parts of the world where cannabis is now legalized. And they cite some quite interesting research that suggests that for some younger consumers, cannabis is an alternative to alcohol, and that, of course, is having an impact on booze as well. What did you make of it, Richard?
Yeah, a couple of things I took away from it. I think the direct-to-consumer aspect is going to be really important to whatever your business is, whether it's booze or bread or even meat. I think the companies that can master that and master the e-commerce space are going to be the ones that are going to survive and thrive going forwards. I mean, here in Austin, there are a lot of craft breweries, and I think it's going to be the way they're going to survive is by delivering direct to people's homes, and things like kerbside collections, and the same way like a retailer is going to deal with it. But it's going to be really tough for your craft brewery, and I hope they find ways to survive, but the ones that figure it out are going to be the e-commerce direct consumers. And then the whole legal cannabis thing is definitely a factor. It's not something that I get involved with, but over here there's a lot of noise about that, and especially in some of the states, Colorado for example, it's a big thing. And I'm sure that has a huge impact on sales of alcohol. But yeah, that was my take on it. What do you think, Laura?
I was really taken by the Gen Z stat and the fact that I think it was the US, isn't it, has had 4 years of consecutive decline of alcohol sales directly linked to that. And, we've heard over the last few years about nightclubs closing, and, that's not the cool place to go anymore, which makes me feel super old. And, has that been driven by the Instagram culture that, the youth of today is nervous about their image and what's posted when they, 20 years ago, that 20, 30 years ago, that wasn't an issue. So I think it probably shows that we're somehow a little bit disconnected with that generation and need to track them really closely about what they're going to spend on going forwards. And then the other thing, I'm just listening to you both speak, and I guess you were saying about curbside collection. Do you think the UK shot itself in the foot by the fact it doesn't really have any dedicated off licenses anymore? Majestic are a big player, but they've been looking for change over the last 6 months or so. But when you look at the Australian model and the whole bottle shop and the drive-through and all that sort of stuff, that they've got their own channel and footprint there where brands can do something different. Whereas in the UK, you've got on-trade and off-trade and a really different margin model. But what's it like in the US, Richard? Is there a separate big off-license chains, and that's kept separate than grocery?
Yeah, 100%. And it's kind of bizarre when you first get here and you think, I'm going to do my shopping and I'm going to buy my alcohol at the supermarket, and some of them don't offer alcohol. You have to do 2 trips. You'll go to the supermarket, get all of your groceries, and then you'll have to go to a dedicated off-license, many of which are drive-through. Which kind of sounds weird when you think about drinking and driving, but many of them are drive-through and they're dedicated and they have separate licensing agreements, and many of the supermarkets don't have those licenses. So it's definitely similar to how you're describing Australia.
Richard, tell us about your second pick.
Yeah, so my second pick is a podcast, and this podcast was produced and put out by IRI. And the podcast was looking at what has happened in the last couple of months, specifically in the meat sector. And it's really interesting. I work for a company called Meyer Natural Foods, and we have a brand called Laura's Lean. And that brand has been tried by thousands of new shoppers than it's ever been tried before. And historically, we would have had to pay many dollars to get that degree of trial and experience. And one of the points the podcast makes is there are many brands out there like ours that have suddenly had this opportunity to have their product tried by all these new customers. And so the big challenge now is, how do you keep the customer attention? So all of the marketing departments out there right now, including ours, are trying to figure out how to do that so that when we come out of this, we still have those customers as regular customers. So I thought that was really interesting. A lot of the shops have trimmed down the number of SKUs that they're offering. And the guy talked about, instead of putting out a £1 pack of chicken, put out 3 £1 packs of chicken, linked together. So they've changed their offering to have to service the consumer that's now going less often and buying a bigger basket. He also talked about a lot of the shoppers getting new kit, air fryers, things which people hadn't tried before, and then going and getting recipes for these new bits of equipment that they hadn't tried before. So a lot of new proteins being tried, different cuts. What do you think about it, Laura?
A couple of things really jumped out at me. The turkey comments were really interesting in terms of, more people are getting back into that category, cooking whole birds and, cooking something that's going to last them a whole week. And I guess we tried more of that over in the UK and some promotions, but definitely in the US it seems to be working. And another thing, probably obviously more so on poultry, but bone-in cuts and dark meat was seen to be quite popular. And that makes me wonder, when you're talking about prices going up, if people will feel more confident about trading down into less expensive cuts, because previously they probably didn't know what to do with it, but now they're going to have a bit more confidence because they've done that trial and error stuff. And then one of the other things, which again we've seen from some of the data over here, is about nostalgia and people getting back into something that they maybe did ages ago. And I suppose that's the whole baking trend as well, isn't it? Trying things you maybe did when you were younger or back in the family unit.
What I thought was really interesting was his comments about how happy shoppers have been to experiment with different cuts, because we had quite a big problem here with people sort of gravitating towards mince, for instance, almost as a default easy option when you're trying to watch what you'll spend, but also just do something that you can't really get wrong. Why do you think that is, that American shoppers have been more willing to experiment? Is there a different sort of level of food education or attitudes towards different cuts to what we're seeing over here?
No, I think it's really just been forced out of necessity. So my personal experience, you will look online for availability or go to the store and you just get what is available, and the selection has been far reduced. And if you go to try to buy chicken thighs, maybe you have to get wings or legs because there aren't thighs available, there isn't breast available, or the cut that you're used to buying. That's been our experience. And then you get home and you get on Google and find a nice recipe for chicken wings or whatever it is. So I think it's been led by necessity rather than anything else.
Excellent. Laura, what's your second pick?
My second pick is an article from the Wall Street Journal, and this is because I love a CEO interview, as you know. So this is Walmart's US boss expects coronavirus to alter shopping permanently. So this is John Furner talking to the Wall Street Journal about how he sees Walmart evolving, and he gives a little bit of insight about how their business has pivoted over the last couple of months at least. It states in the article that US e-commerce sales rose by 74% as more shoppers switched to online ordering, which is an interesting stat, but he gave a bit more insight into what Walmart have done. They've switched on over almost 2,500 additional stores to ship out online orders in recent weeks. And this is, I guess, we're seeing a lot of this, aren't we? That these big central distribution centres can't cope with the demand, and there's more picking happening in store, and something that we did see from the Dave Lewis interview and what Tesco are up to. They've also amalgamated the Walmart separate apps and amalgamating some of their teams as well. And this is all of a long-term push that they've had towards Walmart Plus. And this is to take on Amazon Prime. And they're obviously feeling the pinch about Amazon Prime and seeing how they can take it on. As the interview progresses and he's challenged further about how this will go forward, it has been delayed, but he's still seeing that the omni-channel experience for retail is what he thinks shoppers will want. So the whole bricks and clicks opportunity that Amazon don't have, that he feels that that's going to set Walmart apart. He's also been tracking who's been actually doing more online collections, and it's no surprise it's those customers over 50 that's been doing that curbside collection and doing that more of online shopping. And we probably would have traditionally have thought they would be the last ones to get into this sector of ordering groceries. So that's interesting that that's copied over into the US. He also mentions that the customer satisfaction scores we track for our pickup business has held up pretty well throughout the quarter. So there's obviously amalgamation happening behind the scenes in terms of the merchandising teams coming together. They've delayed the Walmart Plus push, but it's still happening and it's coming in time. They're keen to keep obviously the omni-channel approach and also to do more of that fulfillment and picking from their huge physical estate. So it was a little snapshot, but as I say, I do love to see behind the curtain of what these CEOs really are prepared to share as well, and what they're not prepared to share. What did you think, Richard? That, you know, what are you seeing on the ground in terms of Walmart, and what are your thoughts on the article?
Walmart have really transformed their business fast in terms of a customer experience. So when quarantine hit, we have a Walmart a couple of miles away, and I did curbside collect. So put the order in on the computer, you turn up into a parking spot, and you had to call a number and tell them the number of parking spot you're in and the description of your car. And I pulled in, and it took me 4 attempts to get through on the phone. Like it rung until nobody answered 4 times. And the whole experience probably took half an hour, and then somebody came in, and that bit was great. They just put the food straight into the boot of your car and you go off. Then cut to 2 weeks later, so 6 weeks after my first experience. This time I pulled into the car park. My phone knew that I was at Walmart. It said, "Oh, we've noticed you've arrived. Which parking bay do you want to park in? And what color is your car?" And these were like, they came up on the screen. And so then all I had to do was say the parking number, pick the color of the car, and within 2 minutes, somebody was at the back of my car loading the groceries in, and that was it. 2 minutes, turn around, and then I'm off, and no contact at all. And it was pretty impressive.
Richard, there was something really interesting in the article that made me think of a point you raised a little bit earlier when you spoke about all these new shoppers trying cuts, trying meats, trying products they perhaps hadn't tried before, and the challenge that marketing departments in all sorts of categories and retailers now have in, you know, turning these first-time triers into repeat buyers. That's clearly a big challenge for online grocery now as well. You've got this fantastic opportunity where groups that perhaps wouldn't have been tempted to try things like curbside pickup before are using online. But how do you now, how do you take them from that first sort of distress purchase and actually turn them into repeat customers who are going to be choosing that option on an ongoing basis? That strikes me as a huge challenge. Figuring out loyalty and converting those people into second, third, and so on buyers must be a massive challenge now.
Yeah, and one thing which we've noticed and we've seen across the country, both in the company I work for and across the country, is that meat with claims attached to it has done really well. So grass-fed, organic, free range, antibiotic-free, hormone-free, those sales of those items have outperformed the rest of the category. because people have more time at home to really look into and understand what it is that they're buying.
The other thing that it made me think of, though, is the importance of data. We talk quite a lot about the potential around direct-to-consumer models, and of course, if you are trying to convert some of these first-time buyers into repeat customers, if you own that customer relationship and you have an email address, you have a way of actually following up on some of those purchases. You obviously have a slightly different lever that you could potentially pull than if you don't have direct access to data. My final pick of the week is an article from The Guardian. And it's an article by Sharon Cale called "People Were Like Animals: How Supermarket Staff Watched the Coronavirus Crisis Unfold." I really like this article because it provides a perspective on the outbreak from the front line, and it gives a voice to supermarket workers and how they have experienced this crazy period in their working life. It's really brilliantly written. It's got lots of great detail and observations. There's Layla, the Waitrose worker, talking about how everyone is buying booze and fancy meat and Manuka honey. But actually, the main thing you take away from it is some quite harrowing stuff. Staff talking about how people just totally lost their temper in store at the height of panic buying, abusing staff, shouting, swearing, demanding to speak to multiple layers of store management because they just cannot accept that they're not allowed to buy 20 tins of tomatoes, and just generally, a lack of respect towards staff. And when you read the article, you can really sense the fatigue and exhaustion and exasperation in some of the stories that they're telling. And what I thought was really interesting and again really quite worrying was some research that had been done by the University of Gloucestershire into the health and well-being of frontline workers during the pandemic. And the research included supermarket workers and found that they were, unsurprisingly, really very stressed by the experience. And one of the researchers who conducted the study, Dr. Rachel Sumner, she makes an interesting point in that she says supermarket workers perhaps felt particularly stressed because by and large they did not sign up to be frontline workers. If you are a nurse, you're a doctor, you are a firefighter, you go into your line of work with some sort of knowledge that you're probably going to be in quite stressful situations and at times quite confrontational situations. That is generally not the case if you go to work in a supermarket. So if you suddenly find yourself in a situation like that, I think it's a real shock that you're perhaps not prepared for. And the article overall just raises so many questions about what we can and should be doing within the industry to better protect staff in store, what we can do to ensure that abuse towards supermarket staff is recognised as a serious problem. There have been some really good campaigns within the grocery sector already looking to raise awareness of the issue, but clearly more needs to be done. We need to make sure that message gets through to members of the public and that anyone who does abuse supermarket workers is held accountable as well. Richard, what's been your experience of being in staff and the way the public has generally sort of engaged with supermarket workers? Have you come across anything that's sort of sounds as worrying as some of the stuff that was reported in this article?
I mean, I haven't experienced it personally, but I've definitely seen on social media a lot of examples of stores with strict mask policies and members of public challenging that and citing, it's our constitutional right. The last time I checked, this was a free country and stuff like that. And Costco went viral last week with one of the Costco employees standing firm and basically taking the trolley away from the customer who was saying that kind of stuff. And he said, "I'm a social media influencer and you need to let me through." And he was kicked out of the store. And there have been several examples of that over here. But yeah, it does make you think, not everyone goes to the hospitals to see what's happening there and to be exposed, but everyone has to eat, and everyone has to eat right now by going to supermarkets. So the whole population is coming into contact with the staff, and I really feel for them. One part said only senior managers were authorized to bring out toilet paper to the aisle because they knew it was going to be such a big rush and people elbowing each other Black Friday style out the way. So I thought that was really interesting, and that they would have to be the ones that would police the queuing and making sure that people are the correct distance apart. And these are skill sets which they certainly wouldn't have signed up for when they got the jobs, and the actual security team was struggling, and they said shoplifting was on the rise, and it's challenging. And I'm sure that all of the supermarkets, both in the UK and the US, are having to adapt, the kind of staff they get and how to deal with it. But from a personal point of view, I just really feel for the staff.
Yeah, and I similar to you, I was really taken by that shoplifting point too. Not only did I have a huge amount of sympathy with the people who are interviewed, but the fact that the security staff now in these stores are so busy trying to make everyone queue properly and be safe that shoplifting's just gone through the roof. I have to admit, I have seen some, not the shoplifting bit, but the abuse to staff at relatively low level. When it just pre-lockdown, I was queuing to pay, and a woman in front of me was having an argument with the cashier about how many yogurts she could buy, and she said, "Oh no, it's just 3 items of the same SKU you can have," and a bit of an argument ensued, and the supervisor was called over. And it just feels like so unfortunate. These people are working so hard to try and feed the nation. So I gave said cashier a lot of sympathy and just said, you're doing an amazing job and thank you so much. We are so grateful. But it does still shock me. There is people that are still, and maybe they're under stress at home and we don't quite know, but that are still taking it out on people, as I say, that haven't seen this necessarily as a vocation like the frontline staff, that have stood up and been absolutely counted when we really needed them.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think it's led out of fear and desperation, and certainly at the start it did get a bit Lord of the Flies over here, as I'm sure it did with you, because people just didn't know and they were terrified. And maybe they've got families and they don't have a lot of income, and maybe they just lost their job. And like you say, I think it's easy maybe for me to sit here, I've still got a job, and I'm in a really lucky position. I think there's a lot of desperation and fear out there that's led people to behave out of character to how they would normally behave. And hopefully that's all starting to settle down a bit now. But it's an extreme situation, and it's definitely forced families and people to breaking point for sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today, Richard. We're so lucky that you're our first international guest and giving us some amazing insight across not only the meat category, but what's happening in grocery generally in the US. And we'd love to have you back if we can hold you to that. Yeah,
absolutely. I've enjoyed it, and it's interesting from my point of view to get your perspective on how things are back home. And with pleasure, I'll help share how things are going over here in the US and in Texas. And really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, and
Brilliant.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Richard.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.